Hello again, everyone. Edwin Learnard back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I'm going to be talking about astrology and the death of Marilyn Monroe. Now, many of you may have heard of Marilyn Monroe was a legendary actress. She was born with the Sun in Gemini, Moon in Aquarius, and a Leo ascendant. Now, the Gemini Leo combination and having all, I mean, she in her chart, obviously, it's pointing out to a lot of extroversion and gregariousness. She has 8 of her 10 planets above the horizon, and how, in other words, in houses 7 through 12. She has also, I mean, you're talking about Leo Sun, very extroverted itself. Its outward projection of the person tells me a lot of that Sun and Gemini energy, that basic wants, the wanting to show versatility and express communication, was likely done in a very loud, demonstrative Leo way, where it was very attention seeking. I'm sure she was able to do many different things and had much more talent than just simply being an actress. Now, the thing about it is, you're talking also, and then having that moon in Aquarius, you're talking about the emotional needs might could very well be connected. I mean, with computers, electronics. I know there weren't many computers probably around back then, if any. I don't know what as far as that goes, but things that were innovative, new, ingenious, and also her friends, friendships, groups, clubs, organizations, and the fact that Jupiter is conjunct her moon, it tells me that she likely had, it was very, that was very fortunate for her. Those things that were associated with her moon in Aquarius. Now, what I want to talk about are some natal placements and some transits that might be, we can get some idea, conception, whether she died due to suicide or was it a murder. Now, according to what I was researching on Wikipedia.org, it seems like what was probable was a suicide, that a coroner had stated that her death was a probable suicide. I look at it, there's a lot of speculation and conjecture whether there was foul play involved in her death. And I'm looking, a lot of it does point to where it could be an actual suicide. She has Neptune in the first house in her chart. Neptune, of course, is a planet associated with suicide. It's in flamboyant Leo. It's in at 22 degrees, which really, I mean, you're talking, well, if it's 22 degrees, Leo is a critical degree. 21, 22 degrees fixed signs are critical. She has it again in Neptune, the planet associated with drugs and suicide. It is a ruler of her 8th house of death, and Neptune again could be associated with drugs and suicide. Being in Leo, this is something that was done, that happened, which obviously got a lot of attention, notoriety, and exposure. Another thing too, that I'm looking at now in her chart, she also has Pluto, which is conjunct her 12th house cusp, which could be another indicator of death by suicide, because Pluto, of course, is associated with death. The 12th house is connected with suicide in astrology. Now, another thing that I'm looking at too is the fact on her 8th house cusp of death, she does have Pisces on it, which could increase the propensity for death through suicide. Pisces is the sign connected with suicide, and it's also could be associated with chemicals, poisoning. When she died, there was an excess amount of chemicals in her that shouldn't have been there uh, in as far in her liver, and the thing about that too, and also in her blood. Now at this time, transit Jupiter was in her 8th house. Jupiter, of course, is can be associated with the liver, and Jupiter being in Pisces, Jupiter can be about excess. Remember, as I've stated in previous videos, Jupiter, it's very paradoxical. It could be very strongly benign and benevolent, but it could also have a tendency to enlarge and expand. Jupiter in Pisces by itself can enlarge matters associated with toxin, with chemicals, with things that are poisonous, that with drugs, and she had an excess amount of drug, in at least one drug in her system at this time. Jupiter can also be associated with blood in astrology, and so can Mars. Natally, she has Mars in Pisces in that eighth house of death. So those are some ways I think this actually had, as far as manifested and panned out for her. She also had transit Chiron in Pisces in the eighth house at the time of death. Remember, Chiron is not just about emotional suffering, it can be about physical suffering as well. And something that was drug related was connected with your death. Obviously, Chiron and in Pisces can also be about wounds and suffering through suicide, because Pisces is the sign associated with suicide. She has two planets. She not only does she have the eighth house cusp in Pisces, she has Mars and Uranus in Pisces in the eighth house. She also had transits from Jupiter and Chiron in Pisces at the time of her death. Now, another thing that I'm looking at, though, at the time she had passed, she also had transit Neptune in the fourth house in her chart. So that's an indicator of the of some drugs, some alcohol, even suicide, contributing to the end of life. But the fourth house in astrology can be associated with the latter part of life, but also the end part of life as well. Now, another thing I'm seeing too, at the time that she passed away, she also had the transit Sun in Leo was in her 12th house in her chart. Again, the 12th house can be associated with suicide. The Sun in astrology governs life. Sometimes when you have a transit, when you have the Sun transiting the 12th house, that could be an indicator of that end, that restriction of life. You're talking about the 12th house is a house of endings, and being in Leo, something that was dramatic, that got a lot of attention, notoriety, and exposure. Now, another thing too that I'm looking at in her chart is that one of the rulers of the fourth house cusp is Scorpio, and one of the rulers, Pluto, conjuncts the 12th house cusp, which could be another indicator of her passing through suicide. Now, she has Pluto in the zodiac sign Cancer in her chart. Now, I understand Pluto is generational, but having Pluto in the zodiac sign Cancer can sometimes be an indicator of death in the home. I believe she did die in her home, but I'm not 100% sure of that. You may have to confer that on Wikipedia or research that somehow online, Google it one way or the other. Now, another thing too is when I'm looking at this chart, what's interesting is that the 12th house ruler is the moon, and that is conjunct Jupiter. That falls in, that is in, when you have, you're talking about the 12th house. The 12th house is the house of suicide. And when the ruler conjuncts Jupiter, that can enlarge and expand those issues. And the fact that it's in Aquarius, it's something obviously very unexpected, spontaneous, something you would think would be very bizarre, like you would not really even understand why this actually happened, assuming it was a suicide. Now, I'm not ruling out foul play in this, because the fact is, when this happened, again, going back to transit Neptune and Scorpio in the fourth house of the end of life. Yes, Neptune is a generational planet, but Neptune and Scorpio can be sometimes manifest in something drug related that can be nefarious. Remember that Scorpio is the sign associated with corruption and crime, and it also can be sinister and surreptitious. Somebody may have actually gone in and poisoned her and into her home. Fourth house is also the home, and caused that end of life through drugs, through this in a Scorpio surreptitious manner. She has Saturn in the fourth house in her natal chart, so I mean, in Scorpio, so that's an indicator of obviously difficulties and restrictions at the latter part of life, and it could be due to a murder or death. I am leaning with suicide though, if I had to choose one or the other, because I think there's more indicators for that in contrast to murder. Hold on a moment, people. Sorry about that. I'm back. But anyway, there's really not much more had to say about this than that. Now, she had transit Mercury not far from her Neptune, natal Neptune at the time, so it's not surprising something that there was obviously conversation connected with possible suicide, and then of course what was known to be a drug or overdose one way or another. Uh, it was some kind of barbiturate, some kind of something with a barbiturate was the cause of death, and it was obviously an overdose of drugs, at least one drug. Now, again, having transit Mercury near her natal Neptune at that time, it's not surprising that there was a lot of communication and news regarding her as far as her I mean, the first house is the physical body, and something that was drug related, and it dominated the news. And you're talking about Leo, the sign associated with domination, so it's not surprising it dominated the news, and it was something that, and Mercury can be associated with the news. Now, another thing is really not much more had to say about this, and as far as any transits or natal placements may go that may be tied into her death. Another thing, well, what I'm noticing too is that she also had Uranus in Pisces at 29 degrees. Now, Uranus in Pisces is at 29 degrees, is in the 8th house of death. So you're talking about something that happened. I mean, not 29 degrees in astrology is a critical degree. It's a degree of crisis. So it's not surprising there was something very unusual happen in terms of her death, very unexpected. That was tied into something with chemicals, perhaps drug overdose, and 29 degrees is, of course, the full, I mean, I see it as the full culmination of energy associated with the planet and sign that it is in, and 29 degrees, of course, can overdo it. There was obviously an overdose at this time. Now, an argument could be made that it could have been a friend, somebody that was a former friend did this to her, because Uranus is the sign associated with friendships. But it was really, again, there's not a whole lot more that had to say about this as far as any transits and natal placements associated with her passing at this time. Again, it's just terrible that, I mean, she died at such a young age, whether it was through suicide or through murder at this time. So another thing, on another note, she did have at this time transit Saturn appears to be at least making a rather loose inconjunct aspect to her Leo ascendant, so there could have been some difficulties at this time, I mean, health related, that may have been, Aquarius. I mean, Saturn can of course be about restrictions, and it could be difficulties as well, being in that 6th house, and at least a loose opposition to her ascendant could have indicated there may have been some issues with the ankles, shins. It could have been the circulation, something with the lower legs at this time, the calves as well. And so anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment. Until next time, people, Edwin Learnard saying stay well.